Hey everybody, welcome to another study in the book of Mark. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 2, beginning at verse 13, and we're going to go through chapter 3, verse 6. And a lot of ground to cover, but it's going to be a great study. So if you have your Bible, let's begin reading at verse 13, and we'll read through verse 17. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him, and Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." So this is the second of 5 conflict incidents that we're going to read about in the Gospel of Mark. Yesterday, Gary told about the paralyzed man coming down through the roof, the beginning of chapter 2. And you remember, when that was all said and done, the religious leaders had a problem with Jesus and what he did there. And so now the second and all 5 of these will be covered in what we look at today, these incidents of conflict with Jesus. Jesus is walking along, and he's a rabbi, and probably he's teaching Peter, James, and John, and Andrew, those disciples that he had called earlier. And he passes by a tax collector's booth. And in that booth is Levi, the tax collector. And we're going to know Levi as Matthew. And Matthew literally means gift of God. I like that. And so he calls him and he says, "Follow me. I want you to be one of my disciples." Now, you need to understand this. Tax collectors were despised by their countrymen, fellow Jews. 2 reasons why. 1, because they were considered traitors. They were working for the Roman government. And the Roman government, they were the enemy. They held the Jews down. The second reason is tax collectors were often extortioners. They were given the ability to really charge any amount of tax that they wanted to. And often they would fleece their fellow countrymen, charge them exorbitant taxes just because they could. Now, when Jesus calls Levi to follow him, I don't know if you've thought about this, but that's a big decision that Levi has to make. He's taking a big risk. He's giving up a lot to follow Jesus. When Jesus called Peter, Andrew, James, and John, it says that they left their fishing business. But you know what? If it didn't work out, they could go back and be fishermen. As a matter of fact, after Jesus was crucified, for a little while, those men did just that. They went back to the fishing business. But once Levi made the decision to leave tax collecting and follow Jesus, that was it. There was no going back. And by the way, that was a big deal monetarily, because that was a plum position, because a tax collector could get wealthy in a hurry. So if you remember when we talked about the calling of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, we said whenever Jesus calls somebody, it's true today, it was true then, he's always calling us to leave something. And it was true of Levi as well. So we're told that Levi had a dinner party, and he invited his fellow tax collecting buddies and other sinners to come and have dinner. There may have been 2 reasons for it. 1, it may have been a farewell dinner. He may be celebrating and kind of with his fellow tax collectors saying, "You know, I'm leaving the business, but I just wanted to have one party with you before I go." But I think the main reason was probably because Levi wanted to introduce his friends, those other tax collectors, those sinners, as Mark calls them. I think he wanted to introduce them to Jesus, because Jesus obviously had changed his life. So the conflict that the religious leaders have with Jesus here is centered around this idea: how could he, being a man of God, call a tax collector like Levi into his inner circle? And then how could he have table with other tax collectors and sinners? And let me say a word about table. And what we mean there is have dinner. In that culture, when you sat down to have dinner, when you invited somebody into your home to have dinner, you were embracing them. You were saying, I like you. I want to be around you. And so these religious leaders simply couldn't understand how a man of God could call a tax collector to be one of his disciples into his inner circle, and how he could spend time with, sit down and have dinner with known sinners. These Pharisees, maybe we need to say a word about the Pharisees, because as we continue our study in Mark, we're going to see them interact with Jesus over and over again. The ancient historian Josephus said this about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are a body of Jews with the reputation of excelling the rest of their nation in the observances of religion and as exact exponents of the laws. In other words, these guys took the law really seriously. Now, I think sometimes when we read the Bible, Pharisees get a bad rap, because I don't think all of them were bad guys. Paul, for example, was a Pharisee, and I think he was a really good man, a good-hearted man. He was really serious about loving God. But these Pharisees who are often in conflict with Jesus, I think they were a small part of the group who were in it, not because they loved God and loved his law, but they were in it for the power and the wealth that they could get out of it. I want you to look at verse 17 again with me. This is a pivotal verse in the Gospel of Mark. When Jesus hears about the Pharisees' reaction to his being with Levi and other sinners, Jesus says, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." When he says, "I have not come to call the righteous," he really means, I have not come to call the self-righteous. What he's saying is, you Pharisees see no need for me. And that's because you're self-righteous. Are you really righteous? No. But you sure think you are by the things that you do. And when he talks about sinners, he's talking about people that he sees who are separated from the life of God. And he genuinely liked these tax collectors. He genuinely loved these people that Mark describes as sinners. They didn't follow the law. Jesus wanted to be around them because he saw something in them, I think a humility that made them aware that they needed God. It sort of reminds me of what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount when he goes through the Beatitudes. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn." In other words, those that see their great need for God. That's a good thing. And so when Jesus says, hey, it's not the healthy who need a doctor. The healthy, they don't feel a need. It's the sick who need a doctor, because somebody who's sick realizes, I'm in need of a physician so that I can get better. And Jesus says, that's who I came to call. That's who I love. That's who I want to be around. So the new thing that these religious leaders were struggling with in Christianity is not the doctrine that God saves sinners. They would agree to that. But here's the deal. They would say God saves people who clean themselves up, who keep the law. But Jesus is saying, no, the way God saves people is that he loves them and he saves them as sinners. I am a physician. I have come to save sick people, not well people. And that distinction, which is huge, is what the Pharisees couldn't get their heads around. Now let's read beginning at verse 18, and we'll read through verse 22. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, "How is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not?" Jesus answered, "How can the guest of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins." In the New Testament times, the Pharisees fasted twice a week, on Monday and Thursday. And so when Jesus is asked, "Hey, why aren't your disciples fasting?" He answers with a little parable. And the point of his parable is that there should be joy in the presence of Jesus. Jesus is here. There should be joy. And fasting is a sign of mourning. So they're not fasting because Jesus is here. And as long as he is here, there's going to be joy. And so he tells this little story about a Jewish wedding feast. And you know, I understand that those were times of exuberance, just tremendous joy. And they could last upwards of a week. Just a fantastic, joyous celebration. So Jesus, in this little story, is the bridegroom, and the disciples are the guest. And his point is really simple. As long as the bridegroom is here, there is no fasting. There is no mourning. We're going to rejoice. However, he says, he won't always be here. There will come a time for fasting. And then he tells two other little stories or little illustrations. He says, there is a thing called wineskins, and they were made from goatskins during the time of Christ. And he says, you know, you don't pour new wine into old wineskins. Why? Because when the new wine is fermenting, it gives off gas, and that gas then will explode the old wineskin, and both the old wineskin and the new wine will be ruined. And then he also says, you don't patch an old piece of clothing with a new piece of cloth, because it will tear, it'll make that tear even bigger, and both the old piece of clothing and the new cloth will be ruined. And so his point is that with the newness of Jesus, Jesus coming on the scene and what he's bringing, it can't be confined to old forms. Now, let me read this to you. The main teaching of the parable seems to be that the newness the coming of Jesus brings cannot be confined to old forms. And you see, the Pharisees represented the old forms, the old way of doing things. Jesus, the Son of God, comes on the scene, and he's bringing something new, something fresh, something different. And just like you can't pour new wine into old wineskins, or you're going to have a big problem, well, that's what was happening here. The Pharisees just couldn't get it because they were those old wineskins. Let's begin reading now at verse 23, and we'll read through verse 28. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick up some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" Here's another conflict story with those religious leaders. And the conflict centers around keeping the Sabbath, which was much more serious in the minds of the Pharisees than fasting was. So let's be clear. What Jesus and the disciples did was not breaking the law. As a matter of fact, Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 25 says, "If you enter your neighbor's grain field, you may pick kernels with your hands, but you must not put a sickle to his standing grain." So the disciples and Jesus weren't doing anything wrong. The problem that the Pharisees saw was, you're doing it on the Sabbath. And by the way, you're going to see that over and over again as we travel through the Gospel of Mark. So interestingly, Jesus meets their question. When they question him about what he's doing, his disciples are doing, he meets it with a question. And when you read the Gospels, Jesus would often do that. He answers a question by asking a question. And that's something to think about. And so what he does is he says, "Hey guys, do you remember or have you forgotten the story about David and his men found in 1 Samuel chapter 21, when they were really hungry and they ate the consecrated bread?" Now let me read something about the consecrated bread. "These are the 12 loaves baked of fine flour, arranged in 2 rows or piles on the table in the holy place. Fresh loaves were brought into the sanctuary each Sabbath to replace the old ones that were then eaten by the priest." So what David and his men did technically was breaking the law. But Jesus says it was all right. It was all right. And what he and his disciples did was not breaking the law. But the reason Jesus said that what David and his men did and what he and his disciples did was okay was because the law was not made to restrict man. Let me read something to you. To Jesus, the Sabbath was not created for its own sake. It was a gift of God to man. Its purpose was not to put man in a kind of straitjacket. It was for his good, to provide rest from labor and opportunity for worship. I want you to think about that, because I think that's something that we struggle with to this day. We don't understand why God gave laws. We often think, well, that's just something to restrict us, or it's just arbitrary. It's just a law to have a law for law's sake. Whenever God says, this is the way to do it, and then he says, this is not the way to do it, it's always for the good of man. Sabbath was made so that man would rest and worship, not just to have a law. And now let's finish off by reading chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. "Another time Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal him on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, 'Stand up in front of everyone.' Then Jesus asked them, 'Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?' But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and said to the man, 'Stretch out your hand.' He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus." This is the last in the series of 5 conflict stories. I just want you to note a couple things real quickly. One, they're spying on Jesus. They're beginning to now look for reasons to make him look bad, to accuse him, to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. There's the Sabbath again. And what's interesting, when you look at this, the Pharisees clearly were convinced that Jesus could do miracles. They're just wanting to trap him. And I've thought a lot about that. How is it? Here's a man performing miracles, and you're not going to give him any credit for that. You're just going to try to trap him and make him look bad. Now, why is that? because he was a threat to their power. And if he was a threat to their power, he was a threat to their wealth. It says Jesus was angry. He was frustrated with what was going on, the Pharisees and their way of thinking. And rather than see that as how you and I might get angry, I think you need to think of it as righteous indignation. It's what a good man feels when he is in the presence of stark evil. That's how Jesus felt at the time. And then it simply says that the Herodians joined the Pharisees in their opposition of Jesus, and they did it, again, because they feared what he might do to their political power. And Mark is going to tell us more about that as we journey on through his gospel. And I'll just tell you, if you want to know why they crucified Jesus, that's the reason. Ultimately, that's the reason. Because he was a threat to their political and financial power. Thanks for joining me in the study. We'll pick it up tomorrow. Have a great day.